"Mom, your room at the nursing home is already paid for," my son said, as casually as if he were telling me dinner was ready. And for a moment I thought I had misheard him because the words didn't belong in my life. Not in the quiet little house I had lived in for over 30 years. Not in the kitchen where I still kept his childhood drawings tucked into a drawer I couldn't bring myself to clean out. So I looked up from my coffee and said the only thing that made sense to me. "I never agreed to that." And he didn't even hesitate, didn't look uncomfortable, didn't soften his voice the way he used to when he was a boy asking for forgiveness. He just shrugged slightly and said, "You didn't need to." Like it had already been decided somewhere without me. Like I had already been moved out of my own life and no one had thought it necessary to inform me. And I remember noticing how bright the morning light looked against the kitchen counter. How the hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed louder than usual, how everything around me stayed exactly the same while something underneath it shifted in a way I couldn't quite explain. And I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice, I just nodded once and took another sip of my coffee even though it had already gone cold. Because there was something in his tone, something final, something practiced, like this wasn't the first time he had said those words out loud, just the first time he had said them to me. And behind him, leaning lightly against the doorway, Olivia stood with her arms crossed, her expression calm, almost patient, like she was waiting for me to catch up to a conversation that had started long before I was invited into it. And I realized then that this wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a plan, and plans don't appear overnight. They take time, quiet conversations, decisions made in rooms where your name is mentioned but your voice is not heard. And I felt something settle deep in my chest. Not panic, not even anger, just a stillness, the kind that comes when you understand that asking questions too early won't get you answers. It will only show them how much you don't know. So I didn't ask anything else, I didn't give them that. I simply set my cup down carefully, making sure it didn't make a sound against the table, and said, "I see." Even though I didn't, not yet, but I would, because something about the way he avoided my eyes, the way Olivia's fingers tapped lightly against her arm, the way the word "paid for" echoed in my mind, told me there was more to this story than they were willing to say. And as I stood there in my own kitchen, in the house that still smelled faintly of the lavender cleaner I had used for years, I understood one thing with absolute clarity: whatever had been done had already been done, and if I wanted to know the truth, I was going to have to find it myself. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind would not stay still. It kept circling back to the same quiet details that had not seemed important before. The way Daniel had said the words without hesitation, the way Olivia had not spoken at all, the way everything felt arranged rather than discussed. And sometime around 3 in the morning I got out of bed and walked through the house slowly, touching the back of the dining chairs, running my fingers along the edge of the hallway table, stopping in the living room where the old clock still ticked steadily like it had for decades. And I tried to remember the last time I had felt completely certain about my place here, because now that certainty had slipped in such a subtle way that I could not even point to the moment it had happened, only that it had. And by morning I had already decided that I would not confront them again, not yet, because I needed to understand what had already been set in motion. And understanding required patience, so I followed my usual routine as if nothing had changed. I made breakfast, I watered the small plants by the window, I folded the same dish towel I had used for years, and when Daniel came downstairs already dressed, checking his phone, I noticed something I had not paid attention to before. He did not look around the house the way he used to. He did not pause, did not linger, he moved through it like it was temporary, like it did not belong to him either, or perhaps like it already belonged to someone else. And Olivia appeared shortly after, her heels making a soft, steady sound against the hardwood floor, and she greeted me with that same polite tone she always used, not unkind, but measured, controlled, as if every word had been chosen in advance. And I watched them both more carefully than I ever had, not openly, not in a way that would alert them, but quietly, the way you observe something fragile that might break if you move too quickly. And small things began to stand out, things I might have ignored before. A stack of mail that never reached the kitchen table, a folder Daniel kept close to him, always just out of sight but never far from reach, the way Olivia stepped into another room whenever she took a call, lowering her voice just enough that I could not make out the words, only the tone, efficient, businesslike. And once as I passed by the hallway I heard her say something that made me slow my steps without stopping, something about confirmations and timing, and then a phrase that lingered in my mind long after she had finished the call. "Everything is already processed," she had said, and there was no confusion in her voice, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty. the kind that comes when there is nothing left to decide. And later that afternoon, when Daniel thought I was not paying attention, he opened his laptop at the kitchen table and I caught a glimpse of something on the screen before he angled it away, a confirmation page, numbers, a date, and for a brief moment I saw a word that did not belong to any ordinary conversation. Closing. And I did not react, I did not ask, I simply turned away and continued rinsing the dishes as if nothing had caught my eye, but inside, the pieces were beginning to shift into place slowly, carefully, not enough yet to form a clear picture, but enough to tell me that whatever had been done had involved more than just a conversation about my future. It had involved documents, decisions, transactions, things that do not happen overnight. And as the day moved on, I found myself noticing the silence between us more than the words, the way Daniel avoided sitting down for too long, the way Olivia watched me when she thought I was not looking, not with hostility, but with something else, something closer to calculation. And I understood then that asking them directly would only give them the chance to shape the story before I even knew what questions to ask. So instead I kept my voice steady, my movements calm, and I let them believe that I was still trying to catch up, still trying to understand, because the truth was I had already stopped trying to understand what they were telling me, and had started paying attention to what they were not. I waited until the next morning to leave the house, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted everything to feel ordinary, predictable, like any other errand I had run 100 times before. And when I stepped outside, the air was cool and familiar, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass from somewhere down the street, the same neighborhood I had walked through for decades, the same sidewalks Daniel had once ridden his bicycle on when he was small enough to look back at me every few seconds to make sure I was still there. And I realized as I locked the front door that he had not looked back in a very long time, not in the way that mattered, and I drove myself to the bank slowly, keeping both hands steady on the wheel, watching the traffic lights change one by one, noticing how everything in the world continued exactly as it should while something in my own life had quietly shifted out of place. And when I pulled into the parking lot, I sat for a moment before getting out, not to gather courage but to settle my thoughts, because I knew that whatever I was about to learn would not come with explanations or apologies, only facts, and facts do not adjust themselves to protect you. They simply exist, waiting to be acknowledged. And inside the bank, the air was cool and controlled, the kind of place where everything felt measured and intentional, and I approached the front desk with a calm I did not have to force, asking to speak with someone about my accounts, using the same polite tone I had used for years, the tone of someone who expected routine answers to routine questions. And after a few minutes, I was guided into a small office where a woman introduced herself as Mrs. Green, her voice warm but professional, the kind of voice that had delivered both good news and difficult truths to many people before me. And she asked how she could help, and I told her simply that I wanted to review everything connected to my name, not just the usual statements but everything, and she nodded, turning to her computer, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. And for a while there was only the soft sound of typing and the quiet hum of the office around us, and then I noticed it, not in what she said, but in the way she paused just slightly, the way her eyes focused more carefully on the screen, the way her posture shifted as if she had come across something that required a second look, and she cleared her throat gently before speaking, asking me when the last time was that I had reviewed my property records. And I told her it had been years, that there had never been a reason to, and she nodded again, but this time there was something different in her expression, something cautious, and she turned the monitor slightly so I could see what she was seeing. And at first it was just numbers, lines of text, dates, information that meant nothing until it did, until one word settled into place in a way that made everything else fall silent around it. Closed. And I felt my fingers tighten slightly in my lap, not enough to draw attention but enough for me to feel it. And she continued speaking, explaining in a careful, measured way that the property associated with my name had been sold, finalized, processed, all the necessary steps completed. And she mentioned a date from 3 weeks earlier, a date when I had been sitting in my living room watching the evening news, completely unaware that something so permanent had already been decided and executed. And I listened without interrupting, letting her finish, letting each word settle fully before moving on to the next. And when she was done, she looked at me with a kind of quiet concern, as if waiting for a reaction, but I did not give her one, not the kind she might have expected, because inside, the pieces were no longer scattered, they were aligning, forming a picture that was far clearer than anything Daniel or Olivia had said. And I asked her one more question, my voice steady. asking who had authorized the transaction, and she answered without hesitation, reading the name directly from the screen, and hearing it spoken out loud did not shock me the way it might have before. It simply confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that this had not been an accident, not a misunderstanding, not something done in haste, but something deliberate, planned, and carried out with the quiet confidence of people who believed they would never be questioned. And as I sat there in that small office, with the soft hum of the bank continuing around me, I realized that the house I had left that morning was no longer mine, not in any legal sense, and perhaps not in the way that mattered even before that. And for the first time since Daniel had spoken those words in the kitchen, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not fear, not even grief, but clarity, the kind that does not come all at once, but arrives piece by piece until there is no room left for doubt. I thanked Mrs. Green before leaving the office, not because gratitude was the right response, but because routine politeness felt like the only stable thing left to hold on to. And as I walked back through the bank, past the quiet lines and low conversations, I noticed how nothing around me had changed, how people still filled out forms, still checked their balances, still moved through their day unaware that something as solid as a home could be reduced to a line of text on a screen, marked as completed, finalized, closed. And when I stepped outside, the sunlight felt sharper than it had earlier, not warmer, just clearer, as if everything had been stripped down to its simplest form. And I stood there for a moment in the parking lot, not unsure of what to do next, but aware that whatever I chose to do now would define everything that followed. And I realized I was not confused anymore, not truly, because confusion belongs to moments when there are still multiple explanations. And now, there was only one, and it was precise, deliberate, and entirely real. So I got into my car and drove, not home immediately, but through the streets I had known for years, past the grocery store where I had once compared prices down to the last dollar, past the small park where Daniel had played when he was young. And as I drove, memories surfaced in a way they had not before. Not as soft recollections, but as sharp, distinct moments that seemed to rearrange themselves under this new understanding. I remembered the time Daniel had insisted on helping me organize paperwork after his father passed, how he had said it would make things easier for me, how he had guided me through documents I had barely read, trusting his voice, trusting his patience. And I remembered the subtle shifts that came later, the way he began asking more questions about the house, about maintenance, about whether it was too much for me to handle alone, always framed as concern, always wrapped in the language of care. And I had accepted it because it sounded reasonable, because it came from my son, and because I had believed that care and control could not occupy the same space. And yet now, sitting at a red light, watching the steady flow of traffic move in front of me, I understood that they could, that one could be disguised as the other so completely that you would not see the difference until it was too late to question it. And I thought about Olivia, about the way she had entered our lives with a kind of quiet confidence, never loud, never openly dismissive, but always precise, always aware of the direction of a conversation, the way she could guide things without appearing to. And I remembered small moments I had dismissed, the times she had suggested changes, reorganizations, improvements, each one reasonable on its own, each one harmless in isolation. But now, when placed together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore, a pattern that led directly to this point, to a house that was no longer mine, to a decision about my future that had been made without me. And as the light turned green and I continued driving, I felt no urgency to confront them, no impulse to return home and demand answers, because answers were no longer what I needed. I already had them, not from anything they had said, but from everything they had done. And actions, unlike words, do not require interpretation. They define themselves clearly if you are willing to see them as they are. And by the time I pulled back into the driveway, I was not the same person who had left that morning, not because I had changed suddenly, but because something had been revealed that could not be unseen. And when I stepped inside, the house felt different, not physically, not in the placement of furniture or the quiet ticking of the clock, but in the way it held no certainty anymore, like a place that had already been handed over even if I was still standing in it. And I noticed how Daniel's laptop was gone from the table, how the folder I had seen earlier was no longer visible, how Olivia's voice carried faintly from another room as she spoke on the phone in that same measured tone. And I did not interrupt, I did not announce my return. I simply moved through the house quietly, observing, listening, allowing the reality of what I had learned to settle fully into place, because understanding is not something that arrives all at once. It deepens with each step, each detail, each moment of clarity. and as I stood in the hallway, just out of sight, I heard her say something that confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Something about tickets, about timing, about everything being taken care of, and I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement, because the picture was complete now, not partially formed, not uncertain, but whole, and with that completeness came something unexpected, not anger, not despair, but a quiet sense of direction, the kind that does not rush, does not react, but waits, considers, and then moves with purpose. And I understood then that whatever came next would not be decided in a moment of confrontation, but in a series of choices made carefully, deliberately, the way this had been done to me. And for the first time since this had begun, I was no longer trying to understand what they had done. I was beginning to consider what I would do next. That evening I did not join them for dinner right away, not because I wanted to avoid them, but because I needed a few more minutes alone to think without interruption, and I sat at the edge of my bed with my hands folded in my lap, looking at the familiar lines of the room that had not changed in years, the same dresser, the same lamp, the same quiet sense of permanence that now felt strangely temporary, and I let my thoughts settle into something more structured, because reacting without a plan would only place me exactly where they expected me to be, confused, emotional, dependent, and I understood now that dependency was the foundation of everything they had done. It was the assumption that I would not question, that I would accept what I was told, that I would follow the path they had already laid out, and that realization alone shifted something important inside me, because if their entire plan depended on me staying passive, then the only thing I needed to change was that and nothing else. So when I finally stood up and walked toward the door, I was no longer thinking about what I had lost, I was thinking about what still remained, and more importantly, what they did not know about it. And at dinner I said very little. I listened as Daniel spoke about something trivial, a work meeting, a delayed shipment, the kind of details people use to fill space when they do not want to address what is actually happening, and Olivia nodded along, adding small comments that kept the conversation moving forward without ever allowing it to deepen, and I watched them carefully, not with suspicion anymore but with understanding, because now I could see the pattern clearly, the way they avoided specifics, the way they assumed control of the narrative by never giving it a clear shape. And when there was a pause, Olivia finally brought it up again, her tone calm, almost reassuring, as she mentioned the arrangements that had been made, how everything would be more comfortable for me, how I would not have to worry anymore. And I noticed how she never used the word home, never referred to my house directly, as if removing the word made the reality easier to manage, and Daniel added that it was for the best, that the place they had chosen was very nice. And I nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, simply acknowledging that they had spoken, and that was enough to keep them from pushing further, because they expected resistance or confusion, and without either, there was nothing for them to respond to. And later that night, when the house had grown quiet, I returned to the small desk in the corner of my room where I kept a few old documents, things I had not reviewed in years because I had never needed to, and I opened the drawer slowly, not searching frantically but methodically, the way I used to organize things when Daniel was a child, and everything needed to be kept in its proper place. And I began sorting through the papers, reading each one carefully, not skimming, not assuming, because assumptions were what had brought me here in the first place. And as I moved through them, I found what I had not been looking for but somehow expected to find: older documents, ones that predated many of the changes Daniel had helped me make, papers with my late husband's name, signatures I recognized immediately, details that had not been discussed in years. And I read them slowly, line by line, feeling something steady build beneath the surface of my calm, not excitement, not relief, but awareness, because within those pages was something they had either overlooked or chosen to ignore, something that did not fit into the version of events they had constructed. And I closed the folder gently when I finished, placing it back exactly where I had found it, not because I was done, but because I understood that what I had just read was not something to act on impulsively. It was something to consider carefully, to confirm, to build upon. And as I turned off the light and sat in the quiet of my room, I realized that for the first time since this had begun, I was no longer following their plan. I was beginning to form my own, and unlike theirs, mine would not rely on assumptions, it would rely on facts, timing, and patience, and that difference would matter more than anything they had already set in motion. The next morning I left the house earlier than usual, not in a hurry, but with a clear intention that had taken shape overnight, and I drove not to the bank this time, but to a small office building on the other side of town, one I had not visited in years, but had not forgotten either. And as I parked the car, I took a moment to look at my reflection in the rearview mirror, not searching for reassurance, but simply confirming that I was steady, that I was thinking clearly, because what I was about to do required precision, not emotion, and when I stepped inside, the air carried the faint scent of paper and polished wood, the quiet atmosphere of a place where decisions are made carefully and documented properly, and I approached the front desk and gave my name, watching as the receptionist's expression shifted slightly in recognition, and after a brief wait, I was led into an office where a man stood to greet me, older now than the last time I had seen him, but still composed in the same deliberate way, and he introduced himself again even though we both knew who the other was, and I sat down across from him, placing my hands calmly on the desk, and for a moment neither of us spoke, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the weight of what conversations like this usually carry, and then I told him simply that I needed to review everything my husband had arranged before he passed, not summaries, not general explanations, but the full structure, every document, every clause, every condition, and he nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this request at some point, and turned to retrieve a set of files from a cabinet behind him, and as he placed them on the desk, I noticed the care with which they had been kept. Organized, preserved, not something handled casually or frequently, and as he began to explain, his voice steady and precise, I listened closely, not interrupting, not reacting, allowing the information to unfold at its own pace, and what he described was not simple, not a single account or a straightforward transfer, but a structure, layered, intentional, designed to protect rather than to distribute freely, and as he pointed to specific sections, outlining the way authority was granted and limited, the way access could be controlled under certain conditions, I felt that same quiet clarity return, not sudden but firm, because what he was showing me did not align with what Daniel and Olivia had assumed, and when I asked whether any of these provisions could be altered without my direct involvement, he answered without hesitation, explaining that certain actions would require my explicit approval, properly documented, properly witnessed, and that without it, any attempt to bypass those requirements would not hold in the way people often believe they do, and I let that settle for a moment before asking another question, one that mattered more than anything else, whether there had been any recent activity connected to these arrangements, and he paused briefly, not out of uncertainty, but because he was choosing his words carefully, and then he confirmed that there had been inquiries, requests for clarification, attempts to understand the structure, but no final changes that would override the original design, and hearing that did not surprise me, it simply confirmed what I had begun to suspect the night before, that Daniel and Olivia had acted within a limited understanding, that they had moved forward with confidence based on incomplete information, and that confidence had allowed them to proceed without questioning whether there were parts of the system they did not fully see, and I sat back slightly in my chair, not in relief but in acknowledgement, because what I had now was not just suspicion or theory, it was confirmation, a foundation I could rely on, and as the conversation continued, we discussed what steps could be taken moving forward, not aggressively, not reactively but strategically, ensuring that every action would be supported, documented, and effective. And when I finally stood to leave, the folder placed carefully in my hands, I felt something that had been missing since this began settle firmly into place. Not control over everything, but control over enough to ensure that whatever came next would not unfold the way they expected. And as I walked back to my car, the morning sun now higher in the sky, casting long, clear shadows across the pavement, I understood that they had made their move believing the story was already written, but they had overlooked something important, the part of the story that had never belonged to them in the first place. When I returned home that afternoon, I did not go inside right away. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, and I looked at the house the same way I had looked at it years ago when we first moved in, not as something permanent but as something that required care, attention, and understanding to truly belong to me, and now I understood it again, not as a place I might lose, but as something that had already been taken in one way and could still be protected in another, and that distinction mattered more than anything Daniel or Olivia believed. So when I finally stepped out and walked up to the front door, I carried myself the same way I always had, steady, unhurried, giving them no reason to suspect that anything had shifted beneath the surface. And inside, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate rather than peaceful, and I found Olivia in the living room, seated with her laptop open, her posture relaxed but attentive, and she looked up when I entered, offering a small, practiced smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and she asked if everything had gone well that morning, her tone light, almost casual, and I nodded once, placing my purse on the table, answering simply that it had, nothing more, nothing less, and she watched me for a moment longer than usual, as if trying to measure whether there was anything behind that answer. But I gave her nothing to work with, no hesitation, no edge, just calm, and after a second, she returned her attention to the screen, satisfied or perhaps simply choosing not to press further, and I moved through the house as I normally would, setting things in place, adjusting small details, maintaining the rhythm they had come to expect, because routine has a way of lowering people's guard. And I needed that more than I needed confrontation, and later, when Daniel came home, I observed him the same way I had begun to the day before, not as my son alone, but as someone whose actions now needed to be understood clearly, and he greeted me with the same easy tone, asking if I had thought more about the arrangements, as if repeating the word might make it feel more acceptable, and I told him I had, which was true, though not in the way he assumed, and he seemed relieved by that answer, interpreting it as progress toward agreement, and he began explaining again how everything had already been set up, how the place was ready, how there was no need to delay. And I listened without interrupting, allowing him to speak until he had nothing left to add, and when he finished, I asked a single question, my voice even, not challenging, just precise, asking when exactly everything had been finalized, and he hesitated, just briefly, a fraction of a second that would have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching for it, and then he gave me a date, the same date I had seen at the bank, confirming without realizing it, that there was no misunderstanding between what I had been told and what had been done, and I nodded again as if satisfied and said nothing more, because there was no benefit in showing him that I already knew, not yet, and as the evening moved forward, I noticed something else begin to change, subtle at first but present, a shift in their confidence, not enough to alarm them, but enough to suggest that they believed the situation was under control, that I was moving in the direction they expected. And that belief was exactly what I needed them to hold on to, because it meant they would not look too closely at what I was doing. And later that night, after they had gone to bed, I returned to my room and opened the folder once more, reviewing the documents carefully, matching details, confirming what I had been told earlier, and I began to outline the next steps in my mind, not rushing, not skipping ahead, but moving through each possibility with care, because this was no longer about reacting to what they had done, it was about ensuring that what I did next would be precise enough to hold, to stand, to shift the outcome in a way that could not be undone by assumptions or incomplete understanding. And as I closed the folder and set it aside, I felt no urgency, only direction, because they had already taken their step, believing it was final. And now it was my turn to take mine, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that would matter far more when the time came for everything to be seen clearly. The following morning began like the others, quiet, measured, almost ordinary in a way that might have seemed reassuring if I had not known better, and I moved through the house with the same steady rhythm I had maintained for years, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the light settle into each room as if nothing had shifted beneath the surface, and I was aware that Daniel and Olivia were watching me. Not openly, not in a way they would admit, but in the small pauses, the brief glances, the way conversations seemed to adjust themselves depending on where I was standing, and I allowed it. I allowed them to believe that I was adjusting, that I was slowly accepting the direction they had chosen for me, because that belief made them comfortable, and comfort makes people careless in ways they do not recognize. And later that morning, when Daniel mentioned that they would be out for a few hours to finalize a few things, I nodded without asking what those things were, because I already understood enough to know that whatever they were doing, they believed it was the final step, the closing movement of a plan they thought was complete, and as the front door closed behind them and the house fell into that deep, undisturbed silence, I did not hesitate. I moved directly to the desk, retrieved the folder, and made the calls I had already decided on the night before, my voice calm, precise, giving only the information that was necessary, confirming details, authorizing actions that had been carefully prepared, and each conversation was brief, efficient, without explanation or hesitation, because clarity does not require excess words, it requires accuracy, and by the time I finished there was nothing left pending, nothing uncertain, everything that needed to be set in motion had already been done, and I returned the folder to its place, restoring the room to exactly the way it had been, because appearances matter when timing is involved. And when they returned later that afternoon, carrying themselves with the quiet satisfaction of people who believe they have completed something important, I greeted them the same way I always had, without tension, without distance, allowing them to continue in their certainty, and Daniel spoke about the next steps with an ease that suggested he no longer expected resistance, explaining how everything would be ready soon, how the transition would be simple, how I would not need to worry about anything, and I listened, not correcting him, not challenging him, because there was no need to interrupt a narrative that would soon correct itself, and Olivia added small details, timelines, arrangements, each word reinforcing the structure they believed was firmly in place, and I nodded when appropriate, asking only neutral questions that guided them to reveal just enough to confirm what I had already set into motion. And as the evening settled in, I noticed how relaxed they had become, how certain they were that everything was proceeding exactly as planned, and that certainty was not something I needed to break. Not yet, because its strength depended on time, and time was now working in my favor. And later, when the house grew quiet again and the lights were turned off one by one, I sat alone for a moment in the living room, looking at the space not as something I was losing, but as something that had already served its purpose, and I realized that what mattered now was not the house itself, but the choices that had been made around it, the assumptions that had guided those choices, and the fact that those assumptions had not accounted for everything. And as I stood and turned off the final light, leaving the room in darkness, I felt no urgency, no need to act quickly or dramatically, because everything that needed to happen was already in motion, set carefully, deliberately, in a way that did not require attention to be effective. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to rest, not because the situation had been resolved, but because I knew that when the moment came, it would not be shaped by what they expected, but by what they had overlooked. 3 days later, Daniel came home earlier than expected, the sound of the front door closing with more force than usual, not loud enough to draw attention from anyone outside, but sharp enough to break the rhythm of the house, and I was in the kitchen when I heard it, standing by the sink with a dish in my hands, and I did not turn immediately. I finished what I was doing, set the dish down carefully, dried my hands, and only then did I look toward the hallway as his footsteps moved quickly in my direction, uneven, rushed, and when he appeared in the doorway, his expression was different from anything I had seen before. Not anger exactly, but something closer to confusion edged with disbelief, as if something he had trusted completely had shifted without warning, and he said my name, not calmly, not casually, but with a tension that did not belong in the space between us, and I met his gaze without speaking, allowing him to continue, and he asked me if I had done something, the question vague, incomplete, as if he did not yet have the full shape of what had happened, only the outline of a problem he could not resolve, and I tilted my head slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet acknowledgement, and asked him what he meant, my voice even, steady, giving him no resistance to push against, and he stepped further into the room, running a hand through his hair, his movements no longer controlled, and he began explaining, words coming faster now, that something was wrong with the accounts, that transfers had been stopped, that access had changed, that nothing was responding the way it was supposed to. And as he spoke, I watched the realization form behind his eyes, slowly, unwillingly, connecting pieces that had not been visible to him before, and Olivia appeared just behind him, her composure still intact but strained at the edges, her gaze sharper now, searching my face for something she had not needed to look for before, and I did not interrupt them. I let the silence settle between their words, because silence has a way of making truth more visible than explanation ever could, and when Daniel finally stopped, when there was nothing left for him to say without admitting what he already suspected, I walked past him toward the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down, folding my hands neatly in front of me, not as a gesture of defense but of control, and I looked at him the same way I had looked at the documents days earlier, calmly, precisely, without emotion clouding what needed to be clear, and I asked him one question, the same tone I had used before, asking whether everything had been finalized the way he intended, and he did not answer immediately because now the answer was no longer simple, no longer certain, and Olivia stepped forward, her voice controlled but firmer than before, asking directly what I had done, and I met her gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not avoiding, simply present, and I said that I had reviewed everything, that I had made sure that what was meant to be protected had remained protected, and that anything done without the proper authority would not hold in the way they believed it would. And I did not raise my voice, did not add emphasis, because the weight of those words did not require it, and Daniel took a step back, his expression shifting again, not to anger, but to something quieter, something closer to understanding, and I could see the moment it settled. The moment he realized that the plan he had trusted was incomplete, that there were parts of it he had never seen, and I stood then, not abruptly, but with the same calm I had carried through each step of this process, and I moved past them toward the hallway, not to leave, not to escape, but because there was nothing more to say, not yet, and as I reached the doorway I paused briefly, turning just enough to meet his eyes once more, and I spoke in the same steady tone I had used from the beginning, not harsh, not soft, just clear. And I said, "You should have asked," and then I continued down the hall, leaving them in the quiet that followed, a quiet that no longer belonged to me alone, but to the realization that what had been set in motion had not ended the way they expected.